Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might sound absurd at first glance. The worst business deal in fictional history. And no, it's not Darth Vader's employment contract with the Emperor or Faust selling his soul for knowledge. It's actually a 16-year-old mermaid trading her voice for legs. And when you break down the legal fine print, it makes every predatory loan shark look like a saint. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey through the most catastrophic contract ever signed. Picture this. You're 16 years old, you've just had the worst fight of your life with your father, and you're sitting alone in a grotto filled with broken dreams and shattered treasures. You're vulnerable, you're desperate, and you're convinced that your entire future depends on making one massive, life-altering change. Then along comes someone offering you exactly what you think you want. All you have to do is sign on the dotted line. No big deal, right? Wrong. Because what you're about to witness is a masterclass in predatory contract manipulation that would make modern payday lenders weep with envy. When Disney adapted Hans Christian Andersen's tragic fairy tale into The Little Mermaid, they softened many of the original's darker elements. But what they couldn't soften was the fundamental horror at the story's core. A contract so legally and morally bankrupt that it represents everything wrong with exploitative agreements. And here's the kicker. This isn't just fantasy. Every single manipulation tactic Ursula uses exists in the real world, targeting vulnerable people every single day. Now you might be thinking, come on, it's just a kid's movie about a singing fish. But that's exactly what makes this so insidious. We've been conditioned to see Ariel's bargain as romantic, as brave, as the necessary sacrifice for true love. When in reality, what we are watching is a textbook example of how predators exploit the desperate, the young, and the powerless. By the time we're done tonight, you'll never look at that underwater contract signing scene the same way again. Let's start with the most obvious problem. Ariel is 16 years old. 16. In virtually every legal system on Earth, minors cannot enter into binding contracts without parental consent. The age of majority varies by jurisdiction, but it's typically 18 in most countries, sometimes 21. There are good reasons for this. The law recognizes that young people lack the cognitive and emotional maturity to fully understand long-term consequences. Their brains are still developing, particularly the prefrontal cortex responsible for decision-making and risk assessment. But Ursula doesn't care about any of that. She specifically targets Ariel because of her youth and inexperience. Think about the timing. Ursula doesn't approach Ariel when she's calm and thinking clearly. She waits until immediately after the most traumatic moment of Ariel's young life. Her father has just destroyed everything she loves, everything she's collected, everything that represents her dreams and identity. She's crying, she's isolated, and she's desperate for any solution that will make the pain stop. This is predatory timing at its finest. Real-world predatory lenders use the exact same strategy. They target people who have just lost their jobs, who are facing foreclosure, who are dealing with medical emergencies or family crises. They know that people in crisis are more likely to make impulsive decisions and less likely to carefully read the fine print or seek advice from others. And speaking of fine print, let's talk about what Ariel actually agreed to. Because if you think she got a fair deal, you haven't been paying attention to the details. On the surface, it seems straightforward. Ariel gives up her voice, she gets human legs for 3 days, and if she can get Prince Eric to kiss her within that time, she becomes human permanently. If not, she becomes Ursula's prisoner forever, body and soul. But here's where it gets legally insane. First, the consideration is grossly unequal. Consideration is what each party brings to a contract, and for an agreement to be valid, both sides need to receive something of roughly equivalent value. Ariel is risking her voice, her freedom, her life, her soul, and her relationship with her family. What is Ursula risking? Absolutely nothing. She's not putting up any collateral, she's not facing any consequences if she fails to deliver, and she's actively working to ensure Ariel's failure. That brings us to the second massive legal problem: breach of good faith. Modern contract law requires that both parties act in good faith when performing their contractual obligations. This means you can't deliberately sabotage the other party's ability to fulfill their part of the agreement. But what does Ursula do? She disguises herself as Vanessa, uses Ariel's own voice to hypnotize Prince Eric, and literally prevents Ariel from succeeding. This would be like a landlord agreeing to rent you an apartment, then secretly damaging the property so they could evict you and keep your deposit. Or an employer hiring you for a trial period, then deliberately sabotaging your work so they could fire you without paying your salary. It's not just unethical, it's illegal. Any court would void this contract immediately and award damages to Ariel for Ursula's bad faith conduct. But wait, there's more. The contract is also unconscionable, which is a legal term for agreements that are so one-sided and unfair that they shock the conscience. Courts will refuse to enforce unconscionable contracts, and Ariel's deal hits every single factor that makes an agreement unconscionable. There's procedural unconscionability, which deals with how the contract was formed. Ariel was under severe emotional distress, she had no bargaining power, she couldn't negotiate the terms, she didn't have time to seek advice, and she was pressured into signing immediately. She literally signs without reading the contract, which should tell you everything you need to know about the circumstances. Then there's substantive unconscionability, which looks at the actual terms of the agreement. The consequences of failure are catastrophic and permanent, while the benefits are temporary and conditional. Ariel faces eternal slavery if she fails, but only gets 3 days to succeed at a task that Ursula is actively sabotaging. The power imbalance is so extreme that no reasonable person would consider this a fair exchange. And let's talk about that power imbalance for a moment. Ursula is an adult sea witch with decades of experience in making these kinds of deals. She has magical powers, extensive knowledge of contracts and manipulation, and a proven track record of trapping victims. Her garden is literally filled with the polyps of previous clients who failed to meet their contractual obligations. This isn't her first rodeo. Ariel, on the other hand, is a sheltered 16-year-old princess who has never made a major life decision without her father's guidance. She's never negotiated a contract, she has no legal training, and she's making this decision while in the worst emotional state of her life. The disparity in knowledge, power, and experience makes meaningful consent impossible. But here's what really makes this contract evil. Ursula designed it to fail. This wasn't a legitimate business transaction where both parties could potentially benefit. This was a trap carefully constructed to give the appearance of fairness while ensuring only one possible outcome. Ariel's failure wasn't a risk, it was the goal. Think about the 3-day time limit. Why 3 days? It's not enough time for Ariel to fully adjust to having legs, let alone develop a meaningful relationship with Eric. It's barely enough time to learn how to walk properly. But it's the perfect amount of time to create artificial scarcity and prevent Ariel from seeking help or finding alternatives. The voice requirement makes it even worse. Ariel's voice was her most distinctive feature, the thing that first attracted Eric to her. By taking away her ability to communicate, Ursula ensures that Ariel can't explain who she is, can't tell Eric about her situation, and can't ask for help. It's like requiring someone to win a chess match while blindfolded and with one hand tied behind their back. And then there's the kiss requirement itself. Why a kiss? Because it's subjective, it's romantic rather than practical, and it gives Ursula maximum control over the outcome. Ursula doesn't have to worry about Ariel accomplishing some objective task like solving a puzzle or performing a skill. She just has to prevent Eric from kissing Ariel, which she can easily do by hypnotizing him with Ariel's own voice. This is the genius of predatory contracts. They create the illusion of possibility while systematically removing every avenue for success. The victim feels like they're making a choice and taking control of their destiny, when in reality they're walking into a carefully constructed trap. Real-world predatory lenders use identical tactics. They target vulnerable populations during crisis moments, offer complex products that seem beneficial, create artificial time pressure to prevent careful consideration, and structure the terms to maximize the likelihood of default. The subprime mortgage crisis of 2008 was built on exactly these principles, targeting low-income borrowers with loans designed to fail so banks could foreclose on properties and collect both the payments and the real estate. Payday loans work the same way. They're marketed as short-term solutions for temporary cash flow problems, but they're actually designed to trap borrowers in cycles of debt. The average payday loan borrower stays in debt for 5 months of the year, paying more in fees than they originally borrowed. The loans aren't meant to be repaid quickly. They're meant to create permanent customers who generate ongoing revenue through repeated rollovers and refinancing. Car title loans, rent-to-own agreements, and predatory mortgages all follow the same playbook. Promise immediate relief, obscure the true costs, create impossible repayment schedules, and profit from the resulting defaults and seizures. The victims genuinely believe they're getting a fair deal, just like Ariel believed she was trading her voice for a chance at true love. But here's what makes Ariel's situation even worse than most real-world predatory lending. At least payday loan victims usually understand they're dealing with a business transaction. They might not fully grasp the long-term consequences, but they know they're borrowing money that needs to be repaid. Ariel thinks she's making a romantic sacrifice for love, not entering into a predatory financial arrangement with a known criminal. Ursula presents herself as a benevolent helper, someone who understands Ariel's dreams and wants to make them come true. She frames the transaction in terms of empowerment and opportunity, not exploitation and entrapment. This is classic manipulation, making the victim feel grateful for the opportunity to be exploited. And that brings us to the psychological dimension of what makes this contract so devastating. It's not just legally problematic, it's emotionally abusive. Ursula identifies Ariel's deepest insecurities and desires, then offers to fix them in exchange for everything Ariel values about herself. It's a transaction that requires Ariel to fundamentally change who she is to get what she wants, which is the opposite of healthy personal growth. Think about what Ariel is really trading away. Her voice isn't just her ability to communicate, it's her identity as a singer, her connection to her family and culture, and her primary means of expressing herself. It's like asking a painter to give up their sight or a dancer to give up their legs. The thing she's sacrificing is intimately connected to who she is as a person. This reflects a deeper problem with how we think about self-improvement and personal transformation. Our culture often promotes the idea that you need to change fundamental aspects of yourself to be worthy of love or success. But healthy relationships and genuine opportunities don't require you to sacrifice your core identity. They accept and celebrate who you are while encouraging you to grow and develop naturally. You to grow and develop naturally. The psychological manipulation doesn't stop there. Ursula uses a technique called intermittent reinforcement, alternating between genuine assistance and active sabotage to keep Ariel psychologically dependent. She provides real legs that actually work, creating the initial positive reinforcement that makes Ariel believe the deal is legitimate. But then she systematically undermines every opportunity for success, creating the negative reinforcement that keeps Ariel desperate and off balance. This is textbook abuser psychology. Create hope, then crush it. Provide just enough genuine benefit to maintain the victim's investment in the relationship while ensuring they never quite achieve their goals. It's the same pattern you see in toxic relationships, gambling addiction, and multi-level marketing schemes. The victim keeps trying because they've already invested so much, and because the occasional small win makes them believe that ultimate success is just around the corner. Real-world predators understand this psychology intimately. They know that people are more likely to accept bad deals when they feel they've already committed significant resources. This is called the sunk cost fallacy, and it's why casinos give out free drinks and small wins to keep gamblers playing. why abusive partners alternate between cruelty and affection, and why predatory lenders offer initial teaser rates before jacking up interest charges. Ariel experiences this exact pattern. The moment she signs the contract, she's invested her voice, her relationship with her father, and her entire future in making this work. Each day that passes without success doesn't make her reconsider the wisdom of the deal. It makes her more desperate to somehow salvage it. She can't afford to fail because failure means admitting that everything she sacrificed was for nothing. But let's dig deeper into the specific ways Ursula structures this arrangement to maximize psychological damage. The 3-day deadline isn't just tight, it's deliberately chosen to prevent Ariel from building genuine connections. Real relationships take time to develop. Trust, understanding, and love emerge through shared experiences, honest communication, and gradual vulnerability. By compressing this process into 72 hours, Ursula ensures that any relationship Ariel forms will be superficial and unstable. This mirrors how predatory timeshare salespeople operate. They create artificial urgency with limited time offers that expire within hours, preventing potential buyers from researching the property, consulting with family members, or thinking through the long-term financial implications. The pressure tactics force decisions based on emotion rather than logic, which almost always benefit the seller at the buyer's expense. The communication barrier adds another layer of psychological torture. Ariel has spent her entire life expressing herself through song, and suddenly she's rendered mute at the most crucial moment of her existence. It's not just that she can't speak, it's that her primary form of emotional expression has been stolen from her. Imagine a writer losing their ability to read, or a musician going deaf. The disability isn't just practical, it's spiritually devastating. This communication theft serves multiple purposes in Ursula's scheme. It prevents Ariel from explaining her situation to Eric, which might generate sympathy and assistance. It stops her from seeking help from other humans who might recognize the signs of an abusive situation. And it forces her to rely entirely on physical appearance and behavior to create attraction, reducing her to exactly the kind of shallow interaction that's unlikely to generate lasting love. But here's the truly insidious part. Ursula then uses Ariel's own voice against her, hypnotizing Eric with the very thing she stole. It's not enough to prevent Ariel from communicating, she has to weaponize that stolen communication to actively sabotage any progress Ariel might make. This is psychological warfare disguised as a business transaction. The parallels to modern identity theft are impossible to ignore. Criminals don't just steal personal information to make purchases, they use victims' own credit histories and reputations to secure loans that the victims will be held responsible for. The theft becomes a double violation, first taking something valuable, then using it to cause additional harm. Ariel experiences this exact trauma when her own voice is used to steal away her chance at happiness. Even the location of the contract signing reveals Ursula's manipulation tactics. The meeting doesn't take place in neutral territory where Ariel might feel safe asking questions or seeking clarification. Instead, it happens in Ursula's lair, surrounded by the polyps of previous victims reaching desperately through the water. The environment is designed to intimidate and disorient, filled with visual reminders of what happens to those who fail to meet their obligations. Professional negotiators understand that location affects psychology. High-pressure sales tactics work better in the seller's controlled environment, where the buyer feels isolated and overwhelmed. Car dealerships, timeshare presentations, and door-to-door scams all rely on getting potential victims into unfamiliar territory where normal decision-making processes are compromised. The polyp garden serves as both warning and threat. On the surface, Ursula can claim she's being transparent about the consequences of failure. But the real message is clear. Resistance is futile, others have tried and failed, and questioning the arrangement will only lead to the same fate. It's intimidation masquerading as honesty, designed to make Ariel feel that signing is inevitable rather than optional. This environmental manipulation extends to the contract itself. The document appears official and binding, complete with formal language and mystical enforcement mechanisms. but appearances can be deceiving. The contract violates so many fundamental legal principles that it would be laughable if it weren't so predatory. Let's examine the enforcement mechanism more closely. The agreement specifies that if Ariel fails to receive Eric's kiss within 3 days, she becomes Ursula's prisoner forever, body and soul. This isn't just slavery, it's spiritual kidnapping. The punishment is infinitely more severe than the crime of failing to achieve a romantic connection within an arbitrary time frame. Modern contract law includes provisions against excessive penalties that are disproportionate to actual damages. If you breach a lease by moving out early, your landlord can't demand your firstborn child as compensation. They can only seek actual financial damages caused by your breach. But Ursula's contract demands Ariel's entire existence as payment for what amounts to a failed dating attempt. The soul component makes this even more problematic from both legal and ethical perspectives. Souls, in most philosophical and religious traditions, are considered inalienable. They can't be owned, transferred, or used as collateral because they represent the essence of personhood itself. A contract that claims ownership of someone's soul is fundamentally invalid because it attempts to commodify something that exists beyond the realm of property law. But Ursula doesn't care about legal validity, she cares about psychological control. By demanding Ariel's soul, she's claiming ownership not just of Ariel's labour or freedom, but of her very identity and spiritual existence. It's the ultimate expression of total domination, transforming a human being into property that can be used, abused, or disposed of at will. This soul-stealing element connects to broader cultural anxieties about losing oneself in pursuit of external validation. How many people sacrifice their authentic personalities, values, and dreams in attempts to become what they think others want them to be? The dating apps, social media, and consumer culture all encourage us to package and market ourselves like products, gradually eroding our sense of inherent worth and unique identity. Ariel's bargain represents this cultural pathology taken to its logical extreme. She's literally trading her voice, her primary form of self-expression, for the chance to become what she thinks Eric wants. But she has no idea what Eric actually wants because she's never had a genuine conversation with him. Her entire understanding of his preferences is based on brief glimpses and romantic fantasies rather than real knowledge. This reflects a deeper problem with how we approach relationships and self-improvement. Instead of finding people who appreciate us as we are and growing together naturally, we often try to transform ourselves into what we think others want, sacrificing our authenticity for the possibility of acceptance. But relationships built on false pretenses are inherently unstable, and personal changes motivated by external validation rarely lead to lasting happiness. The 3-day timeline also prevents Ariel from experiencing any of the normal stages of relationship development. There's no time for friendship, for getting to know each other gradually, for building trust through shared experiences. The compressed schedule forces her to try manufacturing instant intimacy with someone who doesn't even know who she really is. This artificial acceleration serves Ursula's purposes perfectly. Real love takes time to develop and would give Ariel multiple opportunities to communicate her situation through creative means. But infatuation can be manufactured quickly through intense shared experiences and physical attraction. By limiting the time frame, Ursula ensures that any connection between Ariel and Eric will be shallow and easily disrupted. The kiss requirement itself reveals another layer of manipulation. Kisses in fairy tales traditionally represent true love's first expression, a moment of genuine emotional and spiritual connection. But Ursula has structured the situation so that any kiss would be based on deception rather than authentic feeling. Eric doesn't know who Ariel really is, what she's sacrificed, or what's at stake. He can't give informed consent to a relationship with someone whose true identity is hidden from him. This consent issue makes the entire arrangement ethically bankrupt, even if Ariel somehow succeeded. A relationship that begins with one party hiding fundamental aspects of their identity, history, and circumstances isn't built on the mutual honesty that healthy partnerships require. Even victory would be hollow because it would be based on Eric falling in love with a carefully constructed illusion rather than Ariel herself. Modern dating culture unfortunately encourages similar deceptions on a smaller scale. People create idealized online profiles, hide their flaws and insecurities, and present carefully curated versions of themselves designed to maximize romantic appeal. But relationships that begin with significant deceptions rarely survive the eventual revelation of reality. The foundation of trust necessary for lasting love can't be built on fundamental dishonesty about who you are. Ursula understands this psychology and exploits it ruthlessly. She's not offering Ariel a genuine chance at love. She's offering her a chance at performing love convincingly enough to fool someone who doesn't know the truth. It's a shallow, manipulative approach to relationships that treats romantic partners as marks to be conned rather than people to be known and appreciated. The contract's focus on physical transformation rather than emotional growth reveals another troubling aspect of the bargain. Ariel believes her problems stem from being the wrong species, rather than from her inability to communicate effectively with her father or her tendency to make impulsive decisions based on fantasy rather than reality. The legs don't address any of her actual underlying issues. They just change the context in which those issues will cause problems. This reflects a broader cultural obsession with external solutions to internal problems. We're constantly told that happiness is just one purchase, one procedure, one life change away. But sustainable fulfillment comes from developing emotional maturity, healthy relationships, and authentic self-expression, not from changing your appearance or circumstances to match some idealized version of success. Ariel's belief that becoming human will solve her problems is tragically misguided. Her real issues are communication, impulsivity, and a tendency to idealize what she doesn't understand while devaluing what she has. These personality traits will follow her onto land and continue causing difficulties in her relationships, her decision-making, and her overall life satisfaction. The transformation fantasy also prevents her from addressing the underlying family dynamics that created her desperation in the first place. Instead of working through her conflicts with King Triton, finding ways to bridge their different perspectives, or establishing healthy boundaries as she matures into adulthood, she simply runs away to a completely different world where the same communication patterns will likely repeat themselves. This escapist approach to problem solving is exactly what predatory contractors count on. They target people who are looking for magical solutions to complex life problems, offering simple fixes that require minimal personal growth or difficult conversations. Want to get out of debt? Just consolidate everything into one easy payment. Struggling with your marriage? Just take this expensive vacation to rekindle the romance. Feeling unfulfilled in your career? Just sign up for this expensive certification program that promises instant success. But here's the thing about real problems. They follow you wherever you go. That Ariel's impulsiveness, her poor communication skills, her tendency to make major decisions based on fleeting emotions, these aren't mermaid problems. They're Ariel problems. And they're going to cause just as much chaos on land as they did under the sea. Possibly more since she's now operating in an environment she doesn't understand with a massive disability she's never learned to navigate. The 3-day deadline also creates what psychologists call artificial scarcity, a manipulation tactic that forces quick decisions by making opportunities seem rare and time-sensitive. Black Friday sales, limited time offers, and flash deals all operate on this principle. The urgency prevents careful consideration and pushes people toward impulsive choices they might avoid if given adequate time to think. Real estate scams frequently use this tactic. Another buyer is interested. You need to make an offer today. This price is only good until midnight. The seller is considering multiple offers, so you need to act fast. The artificial pressure prevents potential buyers from conducting proper inspections, researching comparable prices, or consulting with advisors who might spot problems with the deal. Ariel experiences this exact manipulation. Ursula doesn't say, "Take your time to think about it," or "Discuss this with your family first." Instead, she creates an atmosphere of urgent opportunity. The implication is clear: hesitate and lose your only chance at happiness forever. This pressure tactic is designed to bypass rational analysis and trigger fear-based decision-making. The psychological impact of this artificial urgency can't be overstated. When people believe they're facing a now or never moment, their brains shift into crisis mode. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for careful reasoning and long-term planning, becomes less active, while the limbic system, which handles emotions and fight-or-flight responses, takes over. This neurological shift makes people more susceptible to manipulation and less capable of spotting obvious problems with the deal being offered. Ursula also employs what marketers call social proof, but in reverse. Instead of showing successful customers, she surrounds Ariel with the failures. The polyp garden serves as a twisted testimonial, demonstrating that others have attempted similar bargains and failed. But rather than warning Ariel away, this display actually reinforces her belief that she's special, that she'll succeed where others couldn't. This plays into another common cognitive bias called the overconfidence effect. Most people believe they're above average drivers, better than average lovers, and more likely than others to succeed at difficult tasks. This inflated self-assessment makes them more willing to accept risky propositions, especially when they can see evidence of others who've failed at the same challenge. Gambling casinos exploit this bias ruthlessly. They don't hide the fact that most people lose money, they celebrate it. The flashing lights, the bells, the jackpot announcements, all of these create an atmosphere where everyone knows the house wins, but each individual player believes they'll be the exception. The visible evidence of widespread failure paradoxically increases confidence rather than decreasing it. Ariel demonstrates this exact mindset. She sees the polyps reaching desperately through the water, clear evidence that Ursula's deals typically end in permanent enslavement. But instead of recognizing this as a massive red flag, she interprets it as confirmation that her situation is special, that her love is stronger, that her determination will carry her through where others failed. This overconfidence bias is particularly dangerous for young people whose developing brains haven't yet learned to accurately assess risk. Teenagers are notorious for believing they're invincible, that bad things happen to other people but not to them. Car insurance rates reflect this reality, as do statistics on risky behavior among adolescents. Ariel's age makes her particularly vulnerable to this kind of distorted thinking. The contract also includes what lawyers call an acceleration clause, where failure to meet any part of the agreement immediately triggers the worst possible consequences. If Ariel doesn't get the kiss by sunset on the third day, she doesn't get a grace period, a payment plan, or a chance to renegotiate. She instantly becomes Ursula's property forever, with no appeals process or possibility of redemption. Modern predatory loans often include similar clauses that allow lenders to demand full payment immediately if borrowers miss a single payment or violate any minor provision of the contract. These acceleration clauses turn temporary setbacks into permanent disasters, ensuring that borrowers who might otherwise recover from financial difficulties instead lose everything. Credit card companies use this tactic extensively. Miss one payment and your interest rate skyrockets. Go over your limit by $1 and face massive penalty fees. The punishments are designed to be disproportionate to the infractions, creating a debt spiral that's nearly impossible to escape. What starts as a minor cash flow problem becomes a permanent financial catastrophe. Ariel's contract takes this acceleration principle to its logical extreme. There's no gradual escalation of consequences, no opportunity to cure defaults, no consideration of circumstances beyond her control. The moment the deadline passes without a kiss, regardless of how close she came or what prevented success, she loses everything permanently. This all-or-nothing structure reveals the contract's true purpose. It's not designed to give Ariel a fair chance at transformation. It's designed to create the appearance of opportunity while ensuring inevitable failure. The binary nature of the outcome, complete success or total destruction, eliminates any middle ground where partial success might lead to renegotiation or alternative solutions. Real relationships don't work this way. Love develops gradually, with setbacks and breakthroughs, misunderstandings and reconciliations. Healthy partnerships provide multiple opportunities to demonstrate care, commitment, and compatibility. They don't hinge on single dramatic gestures performed under artificial deadlines with catastrophic consequences for failure. But Ursula isn't interested in helping Ariel develop a healthy relationship. She's interested in creating a scenario that looks romantic, but functions as a trap. The kiss requirement transforms genuine emotional connection into a performance metric, reducing love to a transaction that either succeeds completely or fails utterly. This transactional view of relationships is unfortunately common in modern dating culture. Apps reduce potential partners to profiles that can be swiped left or right based on split-second judgments. People create elaborate strategies for manufacturing attraction rather than focusing on authentic connection. The emphasis shifts from getting to know someone to successfully executing courtship tactics. Ariel falls into this trap completely. Instead of trying to communicate who she is and what matters to her, she focuses entirely on becoming what she thinks Eric wants. She learns to walk, to dress, to behave in ways that seem appealing to him, but none of these efforts reveal her personality, values, or inner life. She's performing femininity and romance rather than expressing her authentic self. This performative approach to relationships is doomed to fail even when it temporarily succeeds. Relationships built on carefully maintained illusions collapse when reality inevitably intrudes. The energy required to constantly perform a false version of yourself is exhausting and unsustainable. Eventually, either the mask slips or the performer burns out from the effort of maintaining it. The irony is that Eric was initially attracted to Ariel's voice, her authentic expression of joy and wonder. The very thing Ursula forces her to sacrifice is what created their connection in the first place. By trading away her voice, Ariel eliminates the quality that made her special to him, then tries to recreate attraction through entirely different means that don't reflect her true nature. This pattern repeats constantly in real life. People notice what makes them unique and attractive, then sacrifice those very qualities in attempts to become more conventionally appealing. Musicians abandon their distinctive sound to chase commercial success. Writers dilute their voice to reach broader audiences. Individuals suppress their personalities to fit in with groups that don't actually appreciate who they are. Ursula's manipulation extends beyond the contract terms themselves to the way she frames the entire transaction. She doesn't present herself as a predatory lender or a soul-stealing demon. Instead, she positions herself as a fairy godmother, a benevolent helper who understands Ariel's dreams and wants to make them come true. This reframing is crucial to overcoming Ariel's natural resistance to obviously dangerous propositions. Professional con artists understand that victims need to believe they're getting a good deal, not being taken advantage of. The most successful scams make targets feel lucky to have found such an amazing opportunity, grateful for the chance to participate. This emotional manipulation prevents the critical thinking that might expose the fraud. Ursula accomplishes this reframing through several techniques. She acknowledges Ariel's pain and validates her feelings, creating a sense of understanding and empathy. She presents the contract as a solution to Ariel's problems rather than a source of new ones. She frames the transaction in terms of empowerment and opportunity, rather than exploitation and risk. Most importantly, she makes Ariel feel chosen, special, worthy of magical intervention. The implication is that not everyone gets this chance, that Ariel has been selected for greatness. This appeals to the universal human desire to be significant, to matter, to be the hero of our own story, rather than just another face in the crowd. This chosen one narrative is particularly effective with young people who are still developing their sense of identity and place in the world. Teenagers often feel misunderstood, constrained by rules and expectations that don't reflect their inner experience. The promise that they're actually special, that their feelings of being different are signs of hidden potential rather than adolescent confusion, can be incredibly seductive. Cult recruiters and multi-level marketing schemes use identical tactics. They identify people who feel undervalued or unfulfilled, then offer them exclusive opportunities to unlock their hidden potential. The targets don't feel like they're being sold something. They feel like they're being invited to join something special, something that recognizes their unique worth. Ariel experiences this exact emotional manipulation. Instead of feeling like she's making a desperate bargain with a dangerous criminal, she feels like she's been chosen for a magical transformation that reflects her true destiny. Ursula doesn't threaten or intimidate. She empowers and validates. The contract isn't presented as a risky gamble, but as a recognition of Ariel's specialness. This emotional manipulation is perhaps more dangerous than the legal exploitation because it prevents Ariel from recognizing herself as a victim. People who know they're being taken advantage of might seek help, resist, or try to escape. But people who believe they're receiving special treatment are more likely to defend their exploiters and rationalize away obvious warning signs. The transformation promise itself represents another layer of manipulation. Ursula isn't just offering Ariel legs, she's offering her a completely new identity, a chance to become someone different, someone better. This appeals to the universal human tendency to believe that our problems stem from external circumstances rather than internal patterns. Weight loss scams, get-rich-quick schemes, and self-help guru all exploit this same psychological vulnerability. They promise that changing one external factor, your body, your income, your mindset, will solve all your problems and unlock the happiness you deserve. The appeal is obvious: simple solutions to complex problems, transformation without the hard work of genuine personal growth. But real personal development doesn't work through magical transformation. It happens gradually through honest self-reflection, difficult conversations, learning from mistakes, and developing better patterns of thinking and behaving. These processes are slow, often uncomfortable, and require sustained effort without guaranteed outcomes. Ariel's belief that becoming human will solve her problems reflects this wishful thinking about transformation. She imagines that changing her species will somehow resolve her conflicts with her father, her impulsiveness, her tendency to make decisions based on fantasy rather than reality. But these personality traits aren't tied to her physical form. They're part of her character, and they'll continue causing problems regardless of whether she has fins or legs. The 3-day timeline also prevents any genuine transformation from occurring. Real change takes time, practice, and often multiple attempts before new patterns become stable. By compressing the entire process into 72 hours, Ursula ensures that any changes in Ariel's life will be superficial rather than meaningful. This rushed timeline mirrors how predatory self-improvement programs operate. They promise dramatic results in impossibly short timeframes, knowing that failure is likely, but that customers will blame themselves rather than the unrealistic expectations. Lose 30 pounds in 30 days. Master a new skill in 1 weekend. Transform your entire life in a week. These promises appeal to our desire for instant gratification and our impatience with the slow pace of real growth. But they set people up for failure and self-blame when the promised transformation doesn't occur. The victims conclude that they lack willpower, discipline, or commitment, rather than recognizing that the program itself was designed to fail. To fail. Ariel's situation becomes even more psychologically damaging when you consider the isolation factor built into Ursula's scheme. By stripping away her voice, Ursula doesn't just remove Ariel's ability to communicate with Eric. She cuts off her connection to every support system she's ever known. Her family, her friends, her entire underwater community becomes unreachable the moment she signs that contract. This isolation is a classic hallmark of abusive relationships and predatory schemes. Abusers systematically separate their victims from friends, family, and anyone who might offer alternative perspectives or assistance. They create dependency by making themselves the only source of validation, guidance, and emotional support. The victim becomes trapped not just by the terms of the relationship, but by the complete absence of alternatives. Ursula accomplishes this isolation with surgical precision. Ariel can't return home to ask for help because she's ashamed of what she's done and terrified of her father's reaction. She can't seek assistance from other humans because she can't explain her situation. She can't even communicate with Sebastian or Flounder, her closest friends, because they're part of the world she's abandoned. The voice theft creates total communication breakdown across species lines. This communicative isolation serves multiple purposes in Ursula's manipulation strategy. It prevents Ariel from receiving advice that might help her succeed or escape. It stops her from building the kind of social connections that could provide emotional support during the stressful 3-day period. Most importantly, it ensures that when things start going wrong, Ariel has nowhere to turn, except back to Ursula. Modern predatory lenders use similar isolation tactics, though less dramatically. They encourage borrowers not to discuss loan terms with family members or financial advisors who might spot problems. They create artificial urgency that prevents consultation with others. They frame the transaction as a private matter that doesn't require outside input. The goal is always the same: keep the victim isolated from anyone who might interfere with the exploitation. But there's another dimension to Ariel's isolation that makes it particularly cruel. She's not just cut off from her support systems, she's placed in an environment where she's completely dependent on the kindness of strangers who have no obligation to help her. She washes up on shore with no identification, no resources, no way to explain her circumstances, and no legal status in the human world. Think about how vulnerable this makes her. She's essentially an undocumented immigrant with a severe disability, dependent on charity for basic survival. Eric's household takes her in out of kindness, but they could just as easily have turned her over to authorities or simply ignored her completely. Her entire plan hinges on the assumption that humans will be generous to a mysterious stranger, which is a pretty big gamble for someone whose entire future depends on the outcome. This vulnerability extends beyond mere physical survival into psychological territory. Ariel has to navigate an entirely foreign culture while pretending to belong there naturally. She has to learn new social customs, new ways of moving and behaving, new expectations for how young women should conduct themselves. And she has to do all of this while maintaining the illusion that she's not completely out of her depth. The psychological stress of this constant performance would be overwhelming under normal circumstances. But Ariel is also dealing with the trauma of having her voice stolen, the pressure of an impossible deadline, and the knowledge that failure means eternal slavery. She's operating under multiple layers of stress that would break most adults, let alone a sheltered 16-year-old who's never faced serious adversity. Yet Ursula's contract doesn't account for any of these psychological factors. There's no consideration for the adjustment period someone might need when adapting to a completely different physical form. No allowance for the learning curve involved in navigating a foreign culture. No recognition that trauma and stress might impair someone's ability to form romantic connections. The 3-day deadline treats Ariel like a machine that should function perfectly regardless of circumstances. This mechanical view of human behavior is another hallmark of predatory contracts. They assume that people can perform at peak efficiency regardless of external stressors, personal circumstances, or reasonable adjustment periods. Payday loans expect borrowers to repay massive fees within weeks, regardless of what financial crisis led them to borrow in the first place. Rent-to-own agreements demand perfect payment records from people who couldn't qualify for traditional credit due to past financial difficulties. The assumption is always the same: if you want something badly enough, you'll find a way to make it work. But this ignores the reality that desperation often impairs judgment and performance rather than enhancing it. People under extreme stress make worse decisions, not better ones. They're more likely to panic, to make mistakes, to miss important details that might help them succeed. Ariel demonstrates this stress-impaired decision-making throughout her 3 days on land. She has opportunities to communicate her situation through creative means, writing, drawing, acting out her story, but the pressure and trauma of her circumstances prevent her from thinking clearly enough to pursue these alternatives effectively. She becomes fixated on the romantic connection with Eric rather than exploring other ways to extend her time or seek assistance. This tunnel vision is another psychological consequence of extreme stress that predatory contractors exploit. When people are overwhelmed, they tend to focus on the most obvious solution to their immediate problem while ignoring alternatives that might be more effective. Panic narrows perception and reduces creative problem-solving ability, making victims more likely to accept whatever solution is presented to them. The romantic framing of Ariel's quest also obscures the practical realities of what she's attempting. She's not just trying to get Eric to kiss her, she's trying to build a relationship substantial enough that he'd want to commit his entire future to someone he's known for 3 days and never heard speak. Even without Ursula's sabotage, this would be an extraordinarily difficult task requiring exceptional social skills and emotional intelligence. Consider what Eric knows about Ariel by the end of their first day together. She's beautiful, she's mysterious, she seems kind, and she can't or won't speak. That's literally all the information he has to base a life-altering romantic decision on. No shared interests, no common values, no understanding of her background, personality, or life goals. Just physical attraction and a few pleasant interactions. In the real world, relationships that move this quickly are usually built on fantasy rather than genuine compatibility. The intense emotions people mistake for love are often just projections, falling in love with their own idealized version of who they think the other person is rather than who they actually are. These relationships tend to collapse quickly once reality sets in, and the fantasy becomes impossible to maintain. But Ursula's contract doesn't require Eric to actually know or understand Ariel, just to kiss her. This reduces their entire relationship to a single physical act divorced from any emotional or intellectual connection. It's the most superficial possible definition of romance focused entirely on immediate attraction rather than long-term compatibility or mutual understanding. This reflects a broader cultural problem with how we think about love and relationships. Movies, books, and songs constantly promote the idea that true love happens instantly, that the right person will sweep you off your feet immediately, that genuine connections are obvious and overwhelming from the first moment. But research on successful long-term relationships shows the opposite pattern. Couples who stay together typically start as friends who gradually develop romantic feelings over time. They build trust through shared experiences, discover compatibility through extended interaction, and choose commitment based on deep knowledge of each other's character. The relationships that begin with instant passion and immediate intensity are actually more likely to fail than those that develop slowly and steadily. Ariel's quest represents the fairy tale version of romance taken to its logical extreme. She's literally betting her entire existence on the possibility that someone will fall in love with her appearance and behaviour within 3 days, despite having no real communication or shared experiences. It's romantic fantasy divorced from any realistic understanding of how healthy relationships actually develop. The kiss requirement itself reveals how shallow Ursula's understanding of love really is. Kisses can mean many different things: affection, gratitude, comfort, lust, social obligation. They don't necessarily indicate deep emotional commitment or genuine romantic love. Eric could kiss Ariel out of sympathy, curiosity, or simple physical attraction without feeling anything approaching the life-changing love that fairy tales celebrate. But Ursula treats the kiss as definitive proof of true love, as if a single physical gesture could capture the complexity of human emotional connection. This mechanical approach to romance reduces love to a checklist item rather than treating it as the deep, multifaceted bond that sustains real relationships through decades of shared life. The contract also fails to specify what kind of kiss counts toward fulfilling the requirement. A kiss on the hand, the cheek, the forehead, a quick peck, or a passionate embrace. The ambiguity leaves room for Ursula to interpret the terms however serves her interests best, another common feature of predatory agreements that use vague language to maintain maximum flexibility for the powerful party. This vagueness extends throughout the contract in ways that consistently favour Ursula. What exactly constitutes true love's kiss? How is this different from other types of kisses? Who determines whether the emotional requirements have been met? The contract leaves all these crucial definitions unstated, giving Ursula complete discretion to decide whether Ariel has succeeded. Professional contract writers know that ambiguous terms create opportunities for exploitation. If language can be interpreted multiple ways, the party with more power will naturally interpret it in whatever way benefits them most. Clear, specific terms protect both parties by eliminating opportunities for creative reinterpretation after the fact. But Ursula has no interest in fair interpretation. The vague kiss requirement gives her multiple ways to claim that Ariel has failed, even if Eric does show romantic interest. Maybe the kiss wasn't passionate enough. Maybe it wasn't motivated by true love. Maybe Eric was confused or conflicted. The subjective nature of the requirement makes it impossible for Ariel to definitively succeed. This subjective evaluation standard is another red flag that appears in many predatory agreements. Multi-level marketing schemes promise success to anyone who works hard enough without defining what constitutes adequate effort. Predatory landlords include clauses about maintaining properties in good condition without specifying what standards apply. The vagueness creates plausible deniability for the powerful party while leaving the vulnerable party constantly uncertain about whether they're meeting expectations. Ariel experiences this uncertainty throughout her 3 days on land. She has no way of knowing whether she's making progress toward the goal or falling behind. Eric seems interested, but is it the right kind of interest? He's affectionate, but is it romantic affection or just kindness to a stranger in distress? The lack of clear benchmarks makes it impossible for her to adjust her strategy or seek help effectively. The psychological impact of this uncertainty is devastating. Ariel can't celebrate small victories because she doesn't know if they count. She can't identify specific problems to address because the success criteria are undefined. She's forced to operate in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing whether she's succeeding or failing until the final moment when it's too late to change course. This strategic uncertainty serves Ursula's purposes perfectly. If Ariel knew exactly what was required, she might find ways to achieve it despite the obstacles. But by keeping the requirements vague and subjective, Ursula maintains complete control over the outcome regardless of Ariel's efforts or Eric's responses. The 3-day deadline becomes even more problematic when combined with this definitional vagueness. Ariel not only has to achieve an undefined goal, she has to do it within an impossibly short time frame while dealing with trauma, disability, and complete cultural displacement. It's like asking someone to win a race without telling them where the finish line is or what route they should take to get there. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Ursula's manipulation is how she makes Ariel complicit in her own exploitation. The contract isn't forced on her through threats or violence. Instead, Ursula creates circumstances where Ariel begs for the opportunity to sign away her rights. She feels grateful for the chance to be exploited, thankful that someone is finally offering her what she thinks she wants. This manufactured gratitude is a sophisticated psychological manipulation that prevents victims from recognizing their exploitation. When people feel like they've been given a special opportunity, they're less likely to question the terms or seek better alternatives. They rationalize away obvious problems because admitting the deal is unfair would mean acknowledging that their gratitude was misplaced. Cult recruitment often works this way. Potential members aren't kidnapped or coerced. They're love-bombed and made to feel special, chosen, worthy of exclusive knowledge or experiences. The targets become emotionally invested in proving they deserve the opportunity, which makes them more willing to sacrifice time, money, and relationships to maintain their membership. Ariel demonstrates this exact psychological pattern. She doesn't see herself as a victim of predatory lending. She sees herself as the fortunate recipient of magical assistance. When things start going wrong, she doesn't blame Ursula for creating an impossible situation. She blames herself for not being good enough to succeed. The manipulation makes her internalize responsibility for outcomes that were designed to be beyond her control. This victim-blaming dynamic is particularly cruel because it prevents Ariel from seeking help or questioning the contract's validity. People who recognize they're being exploited might resist or escape. But people who blame themselves for their exploitation often work harder to meet impossible demands, believing that their suffering is justified by their own inadequacy. The contract's enforcement mechanism reveals the final layer of Ursula's psychological manipulation. When Ariel fails to get the kiss before sunset, she doesn't just lose the bet and return to her original state. Instead, she's transformed into a polyp and added to Ursula's garden of previous victims. This punishment serves no legitimate business purpose. It's pure sadism, designed to maximize suffering and create a visible warning for future targets. The polyp transformation is particularly horrific because it preserves consciousness while eliminating agency. Ariel would remain aware of her circumstances while being completely powerless to change them. She'd be forced to watch as other desperate souls made the same mistake she did, knowing she could warn them but being unable to communicate. It's psychological torture disguised as a business penalty. This disproportionate punishment reveals the true nature of Ursula's operation. She's not running a legitimate business that sometimes has difficult customers. She's operating a systematic exploitation scheme designed to trap victims permanently while maintaining the pretense of offering legitimate opportunities. The Garden of Polyps isn't an unfortunate side effect of her business model, it's the primary goal. Real-world predatory operations often have similar hidden objectives. Payday lenders don't want customers who repay loans quickly and never return. They want customers who get trapped in debt cycles and generate ongoing revenue through repeated fees and rollovers. The apparent business purpose, providing short-term credit, masks the real goal of creating permanent financial dependency. Rent-to-own stores don't want customers who complete their payment plans and own their merchandise. They want customers who make payments for years before defaulting, allowing the company to repossess and resell the same items multiple times. The promise of eventual ownership disguises what's actually a perpetual rental system designed to extract maximum revenue from people who can't afford to buy outright. Ursula's polyp collection represents this predatory business model, taken to its ultimate extreme. She's not just trapping customers financially, she's imprisoning them physically and spiritually. The souls she collects aren't just revenue, they're trophies representing her complete victory over people desperate enough to accept her terms. The contract Ariel signs isn't a business agreement, it's a hunting license. And she's not a customer, she's prey. The entire elaborate setup, the romantic framing, the magical transformation, the 3-day quest, all of it is just sophisticated bait designed to lure victims into a trap they won't recognize until it's too late to escape. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. Ursula's tactics aren't fictional fantasy. They're real-world strategies used by predators every single day. The emotional manipulation, the artificial urgency, the isolation from support systems, the vague terms that favor the powerful party, all of these techniques are documented in academic research on predatory lending, abusive relationships, and exploitative business practices. The only difference between Ursula's contract and modern predatory agreements is the magical window dressing. Strip away the underwater setting and the voice-stealing spell, and what remains is a textbook example of how vulnerable people are systematically exploited by those with more knowledge, power, and resources. Young people facing financial pressures, relationship problems, or major life transitions are particularly vulnerable to these tactics. They're more likely to make impulsive decisions, less experienced at recognizing manipulation, and more willing to take risks in pursuit of dramatic life changes. They often lack the support systems and resources that might help them avoid or escape exploitative situations. The cultural celebration of Ariel's choice makes the manipulation even more dangerous. We've been taught to see her decision as brave, romantic, and admirable, rather than recognizing it as the tragic result of sophisticated psychological exploitation. This cultural narrative makes real-world victims more likely to rationalize their own exploitation as personal empowerment or romantic sacrifice. But the truth is simpler and darker. Ariel's bargain with Ursula isn't a love story, it's a horror story. And the real horror isn't that she makes a bad deal, it's that she's been conditioned to see that bad deal as her only path to happiness. The most effective predators don't force their victims into exploitation. They create circumstances where victims choose exploitation while believing they're choosing freedom. That's the genius of Ursula's scheme and the tragedy of Ariel's story. She doesn't just lose her voice, she loses her ability to recognize that losing her voice was never necessary in the first place. The solution to her problems was never transformation, it was communication. But by the time she realizes this, it's already too late. The contract is signed, the voice is gone, and the countdown to eternal servitude has begun. The countdown creates its own psychological pressure that compounds every other manipulation tactic Ursula has employed. Each passing hour doesn't just bring Ariel closer to failure, it increases her desperation and narrows her decision-making even further. Sleep becomes impossible when you know that time spent unconscious is time not spent pursuing your only chance at salvation. Eating becomes difficult when anxiety churns your stomach and every minute feels precious. Basic self-care becomes a luxury you can't afford when eternal damnation lurks just beyond the horizon. This time, pressure serves multiple purposes in Ursula's psychological warfare. It prevents Ariel from adapting naturally to her new environment, from building genuine relationships, from developing creative solutions to communication barriers. Instead, she becomes increasingly frantic, making desperate attempts to force romantic connection rather than allowing it to develop organically. The deadline transforms what could have been a gradual courtship into a high-stakes performance where every interaction carries the weight of her entire future. Modern neuroscience confirms what predatory contractors have always understood intuitively. Stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline impair higher-order thinking while heightening emotional reactivity. People under extreme time pressure make worse decisions, not better ones. They become more susceptible to manipulation, more likely to accept bad deals, and less capable of recognizing obvious warning signs. The 3-day deadline isn't just arbitrary cruelty. It's a calculated strategy to keep Ariel's cognitive abilities compromised throughout the entire ordeal. The physical transformation itself adds another layer of disorientation that Ursula exploits ruthlessly. Imagine waking up tomorrow in a completely different body, with different proportions, different balance, different ways of moving through space. Your muscle memory would be useless. Your spatial awareness would be completely off. Simple tasks like walking, sitting, or reaching for objects would require conscious effort and concentration. Now imagine trying to appear graceful and attractive while your brain struggles to control unfamiliar limbs. Ariel experiences this exact disorientation, but she's not given time to adjust gradually. She has to master walking, dancing, and human social interactions simultaneously, while maintaining the illusion that this transformation is natural for her. The cognitive load is overwhelming, leaving little mental capacity for strategic thinking or creative problem solving. She's operating in pure survival mode, trying to keep up with moment-to-moment demands while a literal deadline counts down in the background. This physical disorientation mirrors what happens to victims of other forms of exploitation who find themselves in unfamiliar environments or situations. Immigrants targeted by predatory lenders often struggle with language barriers, cultural differences, and unfamiliar legal systems while trying to make major financial decisions. Elderly people facing cognitive decline become vulnerable to scams partly because their changing mental abilities make it harder to process complex information quickly. The disorientation isn't coincidental, it's tactical. Predatory contractors specifically target people during transitions when normal coping mechanisms are disrupted. Recent divorcees, new college students, people who've just lost jobs or moved to new cities, all of these groups are statistically more likely to fall victim to exploitation. The unfamiliarity and stress of major life changes create cognitive vulnerabilities that skilled manipulators recognize and exploit systematically. But Ariel's transformation goes beyond mere physical adjustment. She's also navigating a completely different set of social expectations and cultural norms. Mermaid society and human society operate according to different rules, different values, different assumptions about appropriate behavior. What seems normal underwater might be scandalous on land, and vice versa. She has to learn an entirely new social language while pretending she's always known it fluently. Consider the complexity of human courtship rituals compared to whatever mating behaviors exist in mermaid culture. Eye contact, body language, conversation topics, physical boundaries, gift-giving customs, family introductions. All of these social scripts have to be learned and executed flawlessly while Ariel is still struggling to walk without falling over. She's essentially trying to pass as a native speaker in a foreign culture while suffering from both physical disability and severe communication impairment. The clothing alone presents challenges she's never had to consider. Corsets, petticoats, stockings, shoes. All of these human garments restrict movement in ways that underwater living never prepared her for. She has to learn not just how to walk, but how to walk in long skirts and uncomfortable shoes. How to sit gracefully while wearing multiple layers of restrictive clothing. How to eat and drink without spilling on expensive fabrics she doesn't understand how to clean or replace. These practical challenges compound the romantic ones exponentially. It's difficult to appear charming and attractive when you're constantly worried about tripping over your own feet or accidentally violating some social custom you don't even know exists. The cognitive load of managing unfamiliar clothing, furniture, and social situations leaves little mental capacity for the subtle emotional intelligence that genuine romantic connection requires. Eric, meanwhile, interprets Ariel's struggles through the lens of his own cultural assumptions. Her inability to speak might seem mysterious and intriguing rather than concerning. Her unfamiliarity with basic human customs might appear charmingly naive rather than alarming. Her physical clumsiness might be attributed to nervousness or delicacy rather than species dysphoria. His interpretation of her behavior is filtered through romantic fantasy rather than realistic assessment of her actual needs and circumstances. This misinterpretation creates another barrier to genuine connection that Ursula's contract doesn't account for. Even if Eric develops feelings for Ariel, those feelings are based on fundamental misunderstandings about who she is and what she's experiencing. He's falling in love with his own projection of innocence and mystery, rather than understanding her actual personality, history, or desires. The relationship is built on a foundation of mutual incomprehension that makes meaningful emotional intimacy impossible. But the contract treats this complex cross-cultural courtship as if it were a simple transaction. Kiss equals love equals permanent transformation. No consideration for the gradual trust building that real relationships require. No allowance for the cultural education that intercultural couples need to develop genuine understanding. No recognition that sustainable romantic partnerships require shared values, compatible life goals, and deep emotional intimacy that develops over months or years, not days. This transactional approach to love reflects broader cultural problems with how we conceptualize romantic relationships. Dating apps reduce potential partners to a series of photos and brief descriptions, encouraging snap judgments based on superficial characteristics. Speed dating events promise meaningful connections in minutes. Reality television shows like The Bachelor compress entire courtships into weeks while claiming to produce lasting marriages. All of these cultural phenomena share the same fundamental misconception that love is something that happens to you rather than something you build through intentional effort over time. They promote the fantasy that the right person will be immediately obvious, that genuine compatibility can be assessed quickly, that sustainable relationships can be built without the slow work of getting to know someone's character, values, and life patterns. Ariel's quest represents this cultural fantasy taken to its logical extreme. Not only does she expect to fall in love within days, she expects that love to be so powerful and obvious that it overrides all practical considerations. Eric should be willing to commit his entire future to someone he can't communicate with, whose background is completely unknown, whose personality remains largely mysterious. The depth of connection required for such commitment should somehow develop despite the absence of honest conversation, shared experiences, or mutual understanding. But real love doesn't work this way. Successful long-term relationships are built on much more mundane foundations: shared humor, compatible daily rhythms, similar approaches to conflict resolution, aligned financial values, mutual respect for each other's autonomy and growth. These qualities can only be assessed through extended interaction under various circumstances, not through a few romantic encounters orchestrated under artificial pressure. The kiss requirement also reveals how little Ursula understands about consent and healthy sexuality. Kisses mean different things in different contexts, and meaningful consent requires that both parties understand what they're agreeing to. Eric can't give informed consent to a relationship with someone whose true identity, circumstances, and motivations are hidden from him. Any romantic or sexual interaction that occurs under these circumstances is fundamentally compromised by deception. This consent issue extends beyond the immediate romantic situation to the broader question of what Eric is unknowingly agreeing to if he does fall in love with Ariel. He doesn't know she's not human, that she's made a deal with a sea witch, that their relationship exists within the context of a supernatural contract with catastrophic consequences for failure. He's being asked to make romantic choices without access to information that would be crucial to any reasonable decision-making process. Imagine if someone you just met asked you to commit to a serious relationship, but refused to tell you their real name, their background, their family situation, their financial circumstances, their health status, or their long-term goals. Even if you felt initial attraction, wouldn't you want to know more about them before making major life decisions? Wouldn't the secrecy itself be a red flag that suggested the person wasn't ready for or capable of healthy relationship dynamics? But Ariel's situation is even more extreme because the secrets she's keeping aren't just personal preferences or past mistakes. They're fundamental facts about her species, her legal obligations, and the supernatural forces that will determine both of their fates if the relationship continues. Eric is being asked to fall in love with someone who literally cannot tell him the truth about the most basic facts of her existence. This level of deception makes any romantic connection fundamentally unstable and potentially traumatic for both parties. If Eric does develop genuine feelings for Ariel, discovering the truth about her circumstances would likely feel like a profound betrayal, even though she had no choice about maintaining the deception. The relationship would be built on a foundation of lies that weren't her fault, but that would still poison any future trust between them. The contract also fails to consider what happens after the kiss, assuming it occurs. Let's imagine for a moment that Eric does fall in love with Ariel and kisses her before the deadline. According to Ursula's terms, Ariel becomes permanently human and presumably gets to keep her voice back. But then what? She's still a 16-year-old with no legal identity in the human world, no family support, no education in human customs or practical skills, no financial resources, and no social connections beyond Eric's household. Even in the best-case scenario where Eric wants to marry her immediately, Ariel would be completely dependent on his family's continued goodwill for basic survival. She'd have no legal recourse if the relationship soured, no alternative options if his feelings changed, no independent means of supporting herself if circumstances forced them apart. The transformation that's supposed to represent her liberation actually makes her more vulnerable and dependent than she ever was as a mermaid princess. This dependency dynamic is another hallmark of predatory relationships and exploitative contracts. They promise freedom and empowerment while actually increasing the victim's reliance on the very system that's exploiting them. Payday loans promise financial relief while creating debt cycles that make borrowers more dependent on continued lending. Abusive relationships promise love and security, while systematically destroying the victim's independent support systems and self-confidence. Ariel's transformation follows this same pattern. The promise of becoming human and finding love actually strips away her royal status, her family connections, her cultural knowledge, and her primary means of communication. Even if she succeeds in getting Eric's kiss, she'd be trading a position of relative power and security for complete dependency on the kindness of strangers in a world she doesn't understand. But the contract doesn't acknowledge any of these practical considerations because Ursula isn't actually interested in Ariel's long-term well-being. The entire arrangement is designed around the immediate transaction, not the sustainable life that would supposedly follow success. This short-term thinking is another red flag that distinguishes predatory contracts from legitimate business relationships. Honest contractors consider the long-term implications of their agreements and structure deals that benefit both parties over time. Predatory contractors focus only on extracting maximum value in the shortest possible time frame, regardless of the long-term consequences for their victims. They promise future benefits while creating immediate dependencies that make those benefits either impossible to achieve or meaningless once obtained. The voice theft itself represents another form of long-term damage that the contract doesn't adequately address. Even if Ariel gets her voice back after the kiss, she'd still have experienced trauma from the theft that could affect her relationship with singing, communication, and self-expression for years to come. People who lose fundamental abilities, even temporarily, often struggle with anxiety about losing them again, reduced confidence in their skills, and complicated relationships with activities that once brought them joy. Musicians who suffer hand injuries, athletes who recover from serious accidents, speakers who overcome speech impediments, all of these groups report lasting psychological effects from their temporary disabilities. The fear of recurrence, the awareness of vulnerability, the memory of helplessness, these emotional scars often persist long after physical recovery is complete. Ariel would likely experience similar psychological after-effects from having her voice stolen, especially given the traumatic circumstances surrounding the theft and the life or death stakes attached to its return. Her relationship with singing might be forever changed by the knowledge that her voice can be taken away, that her primary form of self-expression is vulnerable to external control. This trauma isn't addressed in the contract because Ursula doesn't care about Ariel's psychological well-being, only about the immediate terms of their transaction. The contract also creates a precedent that makes Ariel vulnerable to future exploitation. Having successfully manipulated her once, Ursula would know exactly which psychological buttons to push if she ever wanted to target Ariel again. The knowledge that Ariel is willing to make desperate bargains when emotionally distressed, that she values romantic fantasy over practical considerations, that she's susceptible to artificial urgency and social isolation, all of this information could be used against her in future interactions. Predatory contractors often maintain detailed profiles of their victims, tracking which tactics work best on different personality types and in different circumstances. They view successful exploitation as market research that improves their ability to target the same victims repeatedly, or to refine their approaches for similar targets in the future. The transaction isn't just about immediate profit, it's about developing expertise in human manipulation that can be applied systematically. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Ursula's contract is how it makes Ariel complicit in her own ongoing exploitation. She doesn't just sign away her voice, she signs away her ability to recognize and resist similar manipulation in the future. The contract trains her to see desperate bargains as normal responses to difficult circumstances, to accept that getting what you want requires sacrificing fundamental aspects of yourself, to believe that love and acceptance must be earned through self-denial and performance rather than being freely given to your authentic self. This psychological conditioning extends far beyond the immediate 3-day crisis. It shapes how Ariel approaches relationships, challenges, and life decisions for years to come. Having learned that transformation requires sacrifice, she's more likely to accept other exploitative arrangements that promise happiness in exchange for pieces of her identity. Having learned that love must be earned through performance, she's less likely to expect genuine acceptance and appreciation from future romantic partners. The contract doesn't just steal Ariel's voice, it steals her ability to recognize her own worth and demand fair treatment from others. This is the deepest and most lasting damage that predatory arrangements inflict on their victims. They don't just extract resources or create financial hardship, they reshape the victim's understanding of what they deserve and what they should be willing to accept in relationships and transactions. Recovery from this kind of psychological manipulation can take years and often requires professional support to help victims recognize unhealthy patterns, rebuild their sense of self-worth, and develop skills for identifying and resisting future exploitation. The immediate financial or material losses are often the least significant part of the overall damage caused by predatory contracts. But Ursula's manipulation goes even deeper than individual psychological conditioning. It also exploits and reinforces broader cultural narratives about gender, sacrifice, and romantic love that make entire populations more vulnerable to similar exploitation. The story of a young woman sacrificing her voice, her identity, and her autonomy for the chance at romantic love resonates so powerfully because it reflects messages that girls receive from earliest childhood about their worth and their role in relationships. From fairy tales to romantic comedies to pop songs, our culture consistently promotes the idea that women should be willing to change themselves, sacrifice their goals, and subordinate their needs to romantic relationships. The message is clear. Love is the highest good, and anything you give up to achieve it is a worthy sacrifice. This cultural programming makes women particularly vulnerable to romantic manipulation and relationship-based exploitation. Men receive complementary programming that makes them potential unwitting accomplices in these dynamics. They're taught that women who are mysterious, vulnerable, and in need of rescue are particularly attractive romantic partners. They're encouraged to interpret female silence as intriguing rather than concerning, to see female dependency as flattering rather than alarming, to believe that their love can heal trauma and solve problems that actually require professional intervention and systemic change. Eric demonstrates this problematic male socialization throughout his interactions with Ariel. Instead of being concerned that a young woman has washed up on his beach with no memory, no voice, and no apparent family connections, he's charmed by the mystery. Instead of insisting that she receive medical attention or social services support, he's content to let her remain in his household as an entertaining guest. His response to her obvious distress and disability is romantic interest, rather than appropriate concern for her welfare and safety. This cultural programming creates a perfect storm of vulnerability, where women are conditioned to sacrifice themselves for romantic love, while men are conditioned to find such sacrifice attractive rather than alarming. The result is a society where exploitative relationship dynamics are romanticized and celebrated rather than recognized as forms of abuse that require intervention and support. Ursula's contract exploits these cultural vulnerabilities with surgical precision. She doesn't have to convince Ariel that sacrificing herself for love is a good idea. The culture has already done that work for her. She just has to position herself as the facilitator of a romantic transformation that Ariel has been taught to desire since childhood. The manipulation feels natural and inevitable because it aligns perfectly with cultural scripts that Ariel has internalized about femininity, romance, and self-worth. But here's what makes this cultural manipulation particularly insidious. It doesn't just target individual victims, it shapes the entire social environment in ways that make exploitation more likely and resistance more difficult. When romantic self-sacrifice is culturally celebrated, victims of romantic manipulation receive less support and understanding from friends, family, and institutions that might otherwise help them escape harmful situations. People who try to warn victims about exploitative romantic relationships are often dismissed as cynical, jealous, or interfering. The cultural narrative suggests that true love requires opposition, that relationships worth having are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost, that people who discourage romantic sacrifice don't understand the transcendent power of genuine connection. These beliefs make it much harder for support systems to intervene effectively when they recognize predatory relationship dynamics. Ariel experiences this cultural isolation even within her own family. When she expresses interest in the human world, her father's response is prohibition, rather than education. Instead of helping her understand the risks and complexities of cross-cultural relationships, he tries to eliminate her options entirely. This authoritarian approach pushes her towards secretive rebellion rather than informed decision-making, making her more vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who offers to support her forbidden desires. King Triton's parenting failures don't excuse Ursula's exploitation, but they do illustrate how dysfunctional family dynamics can create vulnerabilities that predators exploit. Children who grow up with overly controlling or emotionally distant parents often become adults who are more susceptible to manipulation by romantic partners, cult recruiters, or predatory contractors who offer the acceptance and understanding they couldn't find at home. The generational trauma aspects of Ariel's situation also mirror real-world patterns of exploitation. Families that don't teach children about healthy relationships, financial literacy, or personal safety create information gaps that predators target systematically. Young adults who enter the world without practical knowledge about contracts, credit, or relationship red flags are much more likely to fall victim to various forms of exploitation. Educational institutions often fail to fill these gaps because they focus on academic subjects rather than life skills. Most high school graduates have never taken classes on recognizing manipulation tactics, understanding loan terms, or identifying healthy relationship dynamics. They're expected to navigate complex adult decisions without the knowledge base necessary to make informed choices or recognize when they're being taken advantage of. This educational negligence creates what economists call information asymmetries, situations where one party to a transaction has significantly more relevant knowledge than the other. Predatory contractors rely on these asymmetries to structure deals that appear fair to uninformed victims, while actually being heavily weighted in favor of the more knowledgeable party. The solution isn't just individual education, it's systemic reform that addresses the root causes of vulnerability. But even comprehensive education wouldn't completely eliminate the risk of exploitation because predators constantly evolve their tactics to stay ahead of public awareness. The specific techniques Ursula uses might become well known and recognizable, but new forms of manipulation emerge as quickly as old ones are exposed and countered. The fundamental dynamics of power, desperation, and human psychology that make exploitation possible remain constant, even as the surface details change. This is why focusing solely on victim education, while important, isn't sufficient to address predatory practices systemically. We also need legal reforms that make exploitation harder to execute and more costly when detected. Consumer protection laws, truth in lending requirements, cooling off periods for major contracts. All of these regulatory approaches help level the playing field between powerful institutions and vulnerable individuals. In Ariel's case, basic contract law principles should have protected her from Ursula's exploitation. The age restrictions on binding agreements, the unconscionability doctrine, the good faith requirements, these legal protections exist precisely to prevent the kind of predatory contract that Ursula creates. But legal protections only work when they're enforced consistently and when potential victims know their rights and have access to legal remedies. The enforcement gap is particularly problematic for the most vulnerable populations that predatory contractors target. People in crisis situations often don't have the time, resources, or emotional capacity to research their legal rights or pursue remedies through the court system. They need immediate solutions to urgent problems, which makes them willing to accept terms that they might reject under less desperate circumstances. This desperation creates what economists call a market failure, where normal competitive pressures don't operate effectively. In healthy markets, businesses that offer poor value or engage in deceptive practices lose customers to competitors who provide better deals and honest service. But predatory contractors specifically target people who have limited alternatives and urgent needs, creating situations where normal market mechanisms don't protect consumers. Payday lenders, for example, don't compete primarily on interest rates or customer service because their target market consists of people who can't access traditional credit. Customers choose payday loans not because they're good deals, but because they're the only deals available to people with poor credit and immediate cash needs. This captive market dynamic allows predatory practices to persist, even when they're widely recognized as harmful. Ariel finds herself in a similar captive market situation. Ursula isn't competing with other magical transformation providers who might offer better terms or more ethical business practices. She's the only option available to someone who wants to become human, which gives her complete pricing power and eliminates any competitive pressure to treat customers fairly. The monopoly position allows her to structure deals entirely in her own favor without worrying about losing business to competitors. But the most disturbing aspect of Ariel's situation isn't the individual exploitation she experiences. It's how her story has been culturally reframed to obscure rather than illuminate the predatory dynamics at work. Instead of serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of desperate bargains and manipulative contractors, her story has been transformed into a celebration of romantic sacrifice and personal transformation. This cultural reframing serves the interests of real-world predators by normalizing exactly the kinds of behaviors and decisions that make people vulnerable to exploitation. When we celebrate Ariel's choice as brave and romantic, we're teaching young people that sacrificing their voice, their safety, and their autonomy for romantic possibilities is admirable rather than alarming. We're promoting the same psychological vulnerabilities that predatory contractors rely on to identify and manipulate their targets. The Disney version of the story compounds this problem by adding a happy ending that suggests Ariel's desperate bargain was ultimately vindicated by its positive outcome. But this narrative logic ignores the role that luck and external intervention played in her survival. Her father's last-minute sacrifice, Eric's fortunate recognition of Ursula's deception, the specific timing of various magical interventions, all of these factors were beyond Ariel's control and couldn't have been predicted when she made her initial decision. Celebrating outcomes that depend on unpredictable luck rather than sound decision-making encourages dangerous risk-taking and magical thinking about how problems get solved. It suggests that making desperate bargains is acceptable as long as you believe strongly enough in positive outcomes, that taking enormous risks is justified by the possibility of enormous rewards, that sacrificing your safety and autonomy is romantic rather than tragic when it's motivated by love. But real life doesn't work like fairy tales. Most people who make desperate bargains with predatory contractors don't get rescued by magical interventions or discover that their exploiters are secretly vulnerable to their own manipulative tactics. They just get exploited, and the damage to their finances, relationships, and psychological well-being can last for years or decades. The statistical reality is that predatory contracts almost always end badly for the victims, regardless of how sincere their motivations or how desperately they need the promised benefits. The contracts are designed to fail, the contractors profit from that failure, and the system continues operating because new victims continuously replace the old ones. Individual success stories don't change the fundamental predatory nature of the business model. This is why it's so important to recognize Ariel's story for what it actually is. A detailed blueprint of how predators identify, isolate, and exploit vulnerable people, using sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that are still being used today. The underwater setting and magical elements are just window dressing that distract from the very real and very dangerous patterns of exploitation being depicted. Every technique Ursula uses has direct parallels in modern predatory practices. The emotional manipulation, the artificial urgency, the isolation from support systems, the vague terms that favor the powerful party, the disproportionate penalties for failure, the psychological conditioning that makes victims complicit in their own exploitation. These aren't fantastical elements of a children's story. They're documented tactics used by real predators to cause real harm to real people every single day. The most chilling aspect of Ursula's operation isn't the magic or the underwater setting. It's how perfectly it mirrors the systematic exploitation happening in corporate boardrooms, payday lending storefronts, and predatory sales presentations across the modern world. Strip away the tentacles and the glowing contract, and what you're left with is a masterclass in how powerful institutions identify, target, and destroy vulnerable people for profit. Consider how Ursula's Garden of Polyps functions as both trophy collection and marketing tool. Those reaching desperate forms serve as proof of concept for potential victims. They demonstrate that the service is real, that transformation actually happens, while simultaneously normalizing failure as an inevitable outcome. It's the equivalent of a payday lender's office filled with defaulted loan documents, or a predatory college's hallways lined with dropout statistics disguised as success stories. The polyps also serve another crucial function in Ursula's psychological arsenal. They create what behavioral economists call social proof through negative examples. Ariel sees evidence that others have attempted similar bargains and failed, but instead of deterring her, this actually increases her confidence that she'll succeed where they couldn't. The visible failures become validation of her specialness rather than warnings about the system's predatory nature. This inverted social proof is particularly effective on young people who haven't yet developed realistic assessments of their own limitations and capabilities. Teenagers routinely believe they can succeed at things that have defeated countless adults because their developing brains haven't yet learned to accurately calibrate risk and reward. Predatory contractors exploit this developmental vulnerability ruthlessly, targeting college students with unaffordable loans, young adults with impossible business opportunities, and adolescents with transformative promises that sound too good to be true, because they are. But Ursula's manipulation extends beyond individual psychology into the realm of systemic institutional failure. Her success depends not just on Ariel's naivety, but on the complete absence of protective systems that should prevent such exploitation from occurring. There's no regulatory oversight of magical contracts, no consumer protection agency monitoring sea-witch business practices, no legal aid society helping desperate merfolk understand their rights before signing binding agreements. This regulatory vacuum isn't accidental, it's structural. Predatory industries thrive in environments where oversight is weak, enforcement is inconsistent, and victims have limited recourse when things go wrong. They lobby against consumer protections, challenge regulatory oversight in court, and relocate their operations to jurisdictions with friendlier legal environments when local authorities crack down on their practices. The financial industry provides countless examples of this regulatory arbitrage. When states strengthen consumer protection laws, predatory lenders simply move their operations online or partner with banks in states with weaker regulations. When federal agencies increase oversight of traditional lending, new financial products emerge that technically comply with existing rules while maintaining the same exploitative structure. The specific tactics evolve, but the underlying business model of extracting wealth from desperate people remains constant. Ursula operates in this same regulatory blind spot, offering services that technically comply with magical contract law, while violating every principle of fair dealing and consumer protection. Her contracts are legally binding in the technical sense, but they violate the spirit of contract law so fundamentally that they should be void as a matter of public policy. Yet the enforcement mechanisms that should protect vulnerable consumers from such exploitation simply don't exist in her underwater jurisdiction. This absence of protection reflects a deeper philosophical problem with how societies balance individual freedom against collective welfare. Free market ideologies suggest that people should be allowed to make whatever bargains they choose, even if those bargains are obviously harmful, because restricting contractual freedom reduces economic efficiency and personal liberty. But this approach ignores the reality that markets only function fairly when both parties have roughly equal information, bargaining power, and alternatives. So, when you're scrolling through your phone tonight and see an ad promising to transform your life with one simple change, when someone offers you exactly what you think you want in exchange for just a small sacrifice, when that voice in your head whispers that maybe this time will be different, remember Ariel. Remember that the worst bargains in history aren't made with devils in dark alleys. They're signed with smiling faces, promising dreams come true. The contract was always designed to fail. Don't let them steal your voice. Designed to fail. Don't let them steal your voice.